So the good thing about organising and being the chair of the technical review committee for presentations is you can give yourself a slot really easily. So look, I'm going to talk about the safety profession. And so Eric yesterday said, I don't like the idea of saying safety to professionals. That was after the title of the presentation was already done. But you know, what we've learnt is there's probably never perfect words to use, but we need to do something to convey meaning. So hands up if you consider yourself to be in a safety professional, safety practice, spend the majority portion of your time doing sort of dedicated safety stuff at work. Okay, that's okay. It's close enough. So hopefully relevant to some. So my journey in this started probably after being a safety person for 10 years. Very traditional. I built management systems for organisations. I did a safety university training. It's the only job I've ever done. I've never done any work in my life other than school, university, safety management. So no, absolutely nothing about work, but I've been paid very well to pretend to suggest to an organisation how it should happen for a long time. But then about 10 years into it, I sort of started reflecting and started reading more, and because I was curious as to like how much impact was I really having? Like how was what I was doing in my role making a contribution to people who were actually exposed to the risk? And the more I started to ask that question, the more sort of concern and that I got, and that's when I started doing some different things in my role. And in 2012, I think when Sydney came to Australia, that's when I was just starting to read all of this work that had been done. And I rang Sydney in the lab and I said, Sydney, the stuff you talk about, I think we've been just starting to do it because we were just dissatisfied with what we were doing. So the approach that I was exposed to early on was not actually knowing what I was doing, but just knowing that what I had been doing was not working. And then actually finding out that there was a whole lot of really smart people who could have made that realisation much easier for me. So fast forward, so I'm going to go fast and then I'm going to slow down a little bit when I give you some really practical things that you can do in your role when you leave here even if you can't convince anyone else to do anything different, you can do some things that are a bit different for yourself. So there is a statement of a purpose of a safety practitioner: to support line management, to implement safety processes and practices that meet organisational safety objectives. Normally that would, like for a long time, that would have sat really simply and easy for me, which is, yeah, absolutely, support management, implement safety processes and practices, meet safety objectives. Like that sounds okay, does it? No? Yes? No? Anyone think that's pretty much what we do? Anyone not like it? I don't like it anymore, but I did for a long time. That made a lot of sense. But in there, it's like line management first of all, and this is one thing that I just want to leave as a question in the room. Who is your customer as a safety practitioner? Is your customer the manager, or is your customer the person exposed to the risk? You can answer that for yourself. Is our job to implement safety processes and practices when Pete's just said you can't fix safety with safety? So putting safety in front of anything that we do may not make a contribution. To meet organisational safety objectives. The big assumption we make there is that the organisational safety objectives are the reduction of risk to people who are exposed to those risks. So I started sort of going underneath this, and I will move really fast because I want to talk a little bit about the second part, and then I want to make sure that we stay on time. So there's a paper that this presentation hangs off, and it was, I was fortunate to be able to collaborate with David Woods. So I was really fortunate to be able to spend some time with him. But he got involved after Columbia in the Columbia Space Shuttle accident in the early 2000s, and he was actually part of the government independent investigation review board into Columbia. And they asked him the question at the time, what should we do with the NASA safety organisation? Because the safety organisation has failed, has been part of the failure of that failure. And so there was a chapter that was published in the first resilience engineering book that was co-edited with Sydney and Eric and Dave, called How to Design Your Safety Organisation, a Test Case for Resilience Engineering. Now, as the start of my PhD, I went and dug up over 100 publications on the safety profession in the last 20 years, and it was probably the piece that I thought was the most useful. And so I contacted Dave and said, hey, this thing you wrote 15 years ago, have you done anything with it? And he goes, no, I forgot I even wrote it. So I went, fine, perfect. So then we started moving. So look, you'll get these slides and there's an open access paper that you can do to read. But basically what I say is this list that you've probably read by now, it says yeah, okay, I do those things. And then there's a whole lot of research that we've gone and dug out that says all of the ways that this can go wrong for you in your organisation. And what I want to talk about it going wrong is these diagrams that Dave and I drew, or Dave spoke at me and I tried to make sense of it. So we talk about in a safety one context, which we also talk about as being like centralized control. You have plans, rules and requirements, and then you try to make your operation conform to them. Plan and conform, okay? And it becomes a problem when there's non-conformance. So we started talking about what happens here, and if you focus on the plan and the requirements, and you don't focus on the fluency of work, which is how work actually happens, how adaptations make it happen. And because you think your plan is so good and so complete, your rules are so good, you don't see any more. You don't see what's actually happening in the operation. And it creates these things like covert work systems. So anyone heard of simulated compliance? There's the way that work happens on day shift and the way that work happens on night shift, or what's written on the paperwork versus how work gets done. You create this role retreat. No one's going to stick their neck out, because if they stick their neck out, it gets chopped off. So at the very time when you want people to be stepping outside of their role boundaries and supporting other teams, they're not going to put themselves out there. And these double binds. Be on time, be safe, be compliant, get work done. Stop work, you don't have the authority to make that level of decision. So what we spent some time doing was thinking about, so what is this purpose about? And Sydney, I'm sure, and Eric will see this as very familiar with 3 less words. Dave Woods talked about the time that the fundamental role in safety was to create foresight about the changing shape of risk before people get harmed. So literally after 5 years and 4 publications, that I added 3 words into that said, and facilitate action. Because foresight doesn't change the shape of risk, the action changes the shape of risk. And the role of the safety professional is to facilitate that action proactively before people get harmed. So very proud of my 3-word contribution for the safety professional purpose. There it is. Yes, it's so anyway. So I'm now going to talk about a couple of stories. How am I going for time? A few minutes. Okay, good. So basically, I want to talk about a couple of activities. So you would have seen. Okay, these 7. And I was sorry, like the Cathay guys rang up and said, "Oh, look, I just want to have a chat about some of this stuff. We're trying to use this stuff." So let me just go back to it. Guided adaptability. That was when Dave and I. And Sid and Drew came up with that 2 years ago. The reason was not all adaptations are good. Okay, and this is this conversation between adapting in a way that maintains safety, because people do that. People fill in the gaps and people adapt and people keep your system and your organisation safe every single day. And they adapt for a whole lot of other reasons, for cost and production and to deal with things. And they have incomplete information, and that can be drift. So their adaptations can create risk and their adaptations can control risk. And so we talked about, if you think about control on one hand and adaptation or flexibility or autonomy on the other hand, you want to have guided adaptability. You want to do your best to make sure that those adaptations are safe adaptations. So that's where the guided adaptability, but you can't prescribe how those adaptations occur. All you can do is guide them. You can guide them in processes and practices and capacities to be able to adapt. So that's what I want to talk about. So these are these 7 things that Peter said, and again, there's a lot more detail. I want to give one example of something you can do in your job under each of these 7 things. And we've talked about the first one, explore everyday work. When you explore everyday work, what do you want to know though? Do you want to walk out there and go, hey, that's a pretty cool drilling rig? How do you guys do that? Oh, that's really interesting. I learnt something today. Or do you want to go, I believe you understand. So how do these guys fill in the gaps? How do they adapt? And that's something that I suppose Dave Woods is very persistent about with me is you want to know how your people are filling those gaps. You want to know where they're acting in ways that you actually don't know that that's the way they act to get their work done. So what you want to do is then understand this gap between work as done and work as imagined. And what you want to do with that is facilitate updates to the organisation's models of risk. So you want to go back to the people who is doing the imagining. Is the imagining in your system? Is the imagining in heads of management? Is the imagining in the chief pilot community who believe that they know how those planes are being flown? And you want to actually hold the mirror up and play that information back. Amplify the voice of the front line back to the people who are carrying these models of risks and making these decisions. So you can think about ways in your organisation to go, and that can be as easy as pick up a work instruction and try to understand it. Go and look at work and look at how the two marry up. And then go back into your training system and back into your management system and figure out, this is the point two, what do I do when I know with that gap? Because like I said, not all adaptations are good. So Pete said as well, there are some adaptations that I want to then support. So that is a fantastic way of doing that job. I'll backfill my training system, backfill my management system, backfill my communication. This is now the way that we are very aligned and happy that we will work for this task. Or we need to undermine that. We can't, the maintenance department, for example, has decided that they only want to inspect that piece of equipment every 6 months instead of every 1 month. The engineering department didn't know. You go back to the engineering department and go, hey, these guys are now doing it like this, and they go, no, they're not. Go, okay, let's all get in a room and work out what is going to be the agreed position around this topic. So facilitating and so supporting these local practices where they make sense for safety and getting the work done, but also undermining them and getting them resolved where this gap between work as imagined and work as done is creating risk. Generating action to reduce cold conflict. So things that as I started to care less and less about whether I was going to be able to stay in my job, and I started to get more and more bold with what I would do in my own role as kind of like the test bed. So I tried things. Some were successful and some were spectacular failures. One success I had was being able to go into a project management group and say, every time a project gets over budget, over schedule, we're going to re-baseline that. Because there's no point expecting teams to catch up. So every month, so instead of leading and lagging safety indicators out of the finance department, I get basically budgetary performance of each of the operating units in the organisation. Were people spending their maintenance budget? Were they not spending their maintenance budget? Their production targets, who was above target, who was below target. I get a red, amber, green traffic light. Plus or minus 5% of plan was green, plus or minus 10%, greater than 10% was red. And go and have a conversation with each one of those units and say, the increasing goal conflict is being pushed into your area now. Are you starting to make trade-off decisions around safety? Yeah, of course, we're trying to catch up. Okay, not anymore. This is the new target for the rest of the year. Why would you have a operation that was 3 months into a 12-month production target period, have an unexpected outage, and then have 9 months of goal conflict in your organisation trying to get them to chase it and catch up? They're not going to try any harder. They'll probably actually try too hard. And you'll have problems in your operation. So these are things that safety, and you notice, like, I don't even know if safety is on this, there is sacrifice judgments for safety. But safety starts to disappear and it becomes much harder for us to do this, but you can do these types of experiments. Nothing stops you going and getting the production information out of your organisation and going and talking to the people who own that production and asking them if they feel pressure. And if they say yes, say, let's have a meeting with now your manager. And let's talk about what we're going to do to alleviate that pressure. Facilitating the free flow of data and information. So things fall through the cracks. I mean, there's a good saying, things fall through the cracks. Organisations have silos, interdependencies, and boundaries. So our role is we get to look at the entire organisation. We get to look from the boardroom to the front line. We get to look from the IT department to the project department to the procurement department. We should be able to see these cracks. We should be able to see the engineering information not making it to the procurement information, the operations information not making it into the project organisation. Our role is to facilitate those flows of information, both informally and building formal processes. Generating future operational scenarios. So we've talked about risk assessment. I think for those who have heard of the Safety of Work podcast, I think Drew and I in episode 8 said, do risk matrices and risk assessments help us make better decisions? The answer is no. The research is very clear on that. Very clear. So when I say very clear, in many scientific disciplines, you can almost find evidence for many things that you're trying to say, argued from different positions, but I actually can't find the positive side of the empirical basis for saying, yes, risk assessments are good. So that's why I was trying to say very clear. But we do need to generate operational scenarios in the future. So if we are 3,000 hours behind in our maintenance data now, and we're heading into our most busy uptime period, in 3 months' time, we're going to be 6,000 hours behind. Once we get 6,000 hours behind, I've gone and spoken to the maintenance department and we are not even able to maintain our safety critical maintenance activities. Like, these were conversations I was never having in my safety career until the last couple of years in my role. I've said, my role is to do these types of things. And generating those scenarios and going back to your organisation and playing that out to say, this is the real-time information of what is happening in our organisation. This is the trajectory that we're on, and this is what the result could be. And how do we want to act now to change those future conditions? I want to tell a very specific story about the facilitation of making sacrifice judgment. This is where sometimes safety and getting work done always trade off. And I think that Eric has this beautiful slide he uses all the time about the unacceptable performance. And I think, Eric, you said yesterday that line moves around a lot depending on other pressures in the organisation about what's acceptable and what's unacceptable level of performance. But it can be really hard for people to do this. So I was talking to Pete and the Cathay team last night, and thanks, Pete, for bringing the team down here. Really appreciate it. About one of the assumptions that their management of their airline would make is that, yeah, but at the end of the day, a pilot's never going to take off that plane unless everything's perfectly fine. So making sacrifice judgments for safety are hard. So I remember, so one of the things you can do is, what is coming up in your organisation in the next week or the next 2 weeks that carries a lot of uncertainty or risk around it? And what I used to do when I was in my last role on a Monday morning is I had a pretty good finger on the pulse because I had a team that did all the work, and I got to basically just walk the carpet like Pete, or Pete's team at least anyway, was basically to start ringing around the operations managers on and this is right down the organisation. This is like, these were teams that were like so far from me in the organisation, but people would pick up the phone and talk to you anyway, and say, what's happening in your operation this week? What are you worried about this week? And one conversation I recall I had, Sean was closely involved in at the time as well. We're doing quite an intricate heavy lift flare tip replacement of an offshore oil and gas platform. $1 million a day or $500,000 a day aircraft from Canada.
The quote was in two parts. The aircraft quote was, when I asked them to quote for it, was aircraft, 1.2 million, job, 800,000.
Okay, so that's it. Not many aircraft in the world can do this sort of job. And they were scheduled on a particular day, and I rang the operations manager and said, look, the weather's within the envelope of the risk assessment, but the weather's going to be better 2 days later, and I'd prefer to do it then. But he goes, I can't tell my boss that. This is the operations manager. This is the guy who runs the platform. He goes, that's not going to go down well. I said, your job's to tell me, my job's to get the organisation to make that decision. And I'm happy to look like the bad guy. That's fine. So you understand that it's hard, and our job is to actually facilitate those decisions to be made. Find ways to put the thumb on the scale a little bit for safety, because it's not easy for everyone in all their jobs to be able to do that. So some of those things I actually personally count and reflect on as my greatest successes. Nothing to do with safety, but just being able to help a decision get made. And then we've talked a lot about facilitating learning process from daily and organisational life, as well as from unexpected events. You still want to learn from surprise. Surprise is really interesting. And when you're out there exploring everyday work, going, what are the things that I'd never seen before, as much as what are the things that I see every day? I was talking to the guys from Cathay again about these 12,000 reports or however, and training reports. I said, put a question on the bottom and ask the check and training captain, what surprised me in this simulation? Or what did I see in this simulation that I've never seen before? And questions like that, and then you'll get the information that you need to understand how your people are responding to emergent situations that they face. So I'm not going to talk about the next model because I'm over time. Yep. So there's just I'm not even going to put up the slide. But the paper's open access. You can read it. You can debate it with me. But I'd really love to get a couple of questions, and then we are going to have afternoon tea.
I'm feeling like the general consensus is risk assessment, traditional risk assessments kind of suck, don't work. What's the alternative? And I know that's probably an open-ended kind of question because it would be different for different types of industry. But has the research indicated what would be best? And two-parter question, how could we influence our regulating body to take a look at producing something that would be more appropriate for how we're evolving as industry and culture. Because when you say that and the theme around the room, I sort of think, yeah, I agree. All we do in our end, we sit around with people and we go through the hazards and break it down to controls and then actions, and then we have our score, and then it's put to bed and it's forgotten about until something happens or changes. So what would be the more appropriate tool, and how can we bring that into our legislation? Because with the harmonisation and everything, you must risk assess, you must risk assess, you must risk assess. It's not defined, I get that, and everyone has their own kind of tool, but what would be indicating the better one? And I know it's kind of a bit of a shitty question, but...
No, not at all. Like, it's a very important question. Tools are a very important question, and what we do. I think the thing is, if I go back to what we've spoken about in the last couple of days, is and maybe to Eric's resilient potentials as well, understanding how work happens in our organisation and what are the potential safety consequences and other consequences as a result of that is kind of the starting point. And then I suppose from the tools question becomes, how do I combine, filter, aggregate, understand that information and inform decision making? Then there's probably another half-hour conversation about how you might do that. But I think even the tool, one of the hard things we did with safety work versus the safety of work, which came out of a model during my PhD where I tracked sort of safety professionals over 6 or 7 months, interviewing them twice a month saying, what are you doing in your job? Why are you doing it? Who are you doing it for? Who are you doing it with? What are you trying to achieve as an outcome? That was kind of it. And then it was I'm doing a risk assessment. No. Well, I'm facilitating this risk assessment workshop. Okay, why? Oh, because we have to do a risk assessment. And getting really clear about why are you doing it because you have to have a risk assessment? Then don't bother. Are you doing it because the manager's made a decision and gone to you in the safety department and said, you need to do a risk assessment, so if anyone asks me about this decision, I can show them it's okay because I've got a safety risk assessment. Or, but no one ever said, my manager has, or a manager or a worker has brought me a problem, and we are using this process with a diverse group of people to understand how we are going to move forward, and we don't know yet. Then I'd say risk assessment might be a good tool, or that process, but it's hardly the tool then, it's actually the environment that's going to have that discussion and dialogue and come up with the course of action. So I think the question to check in with yourself, or what I learnt from that work to check in yourself is, why am I doing this? And the thing that scared me and hurt me and probably made me regret a lot of things in my career was, if the answer's not to reduce risk to the frontline workforce, then be very deliberate about whether you're doing that activity. Just be very deliberate about why you're doing it. And if there's something you could be doing to reduce risk to your workforce, then I'd say do that instead of what you're doing. So I know it doesn't answer your question, but it's not really a tools thing. It's kind of like a purpose thing, and then the tool can either be good or bad. Let's say we take 5, good or bad.
Thank you, David. You spoke about the papers that you and your colleagues have written about guided adaptability, our role of functions as safety to professional practitioners. Where can we find those papers?
Yeah, we can send those out. I'd love you to read them.
Thank you.
Love you to read them. So, very easily, yeah.
Just like to share my thought with you and see to what extent you agree with that. Now, looking at these duties of a safety to a professional, it seems like a lot of work that involve field work, like because you need to go to observe work is done, and emphasize the learning aspect. So there's a lot of time and work needed to be done in the field. That means that the safety manager would obviously delegate much of that work to the lower level of safety persons. And from my experience, I think here's one of the barriers for the safety too, because usually, or in many cases that I've experienced myself, is that people at the top level of safety department have access to knowledge that is not really available for people and the lower level in the safety department. And that's why whenever a safety manager asks his colleagues and his subordinates to go and do the safety 2 work, which involve asking tough questions and in-depth understanding of what's happening, they fail to do so because, as I said, they lack the competency and knowledge. They usually don't attend this kind of conferences and forums and stuff like that. So what do you think? Do you think this is really a problem, or maybe something that I've just...
Oh, I think a couple of things in what you've said there. I want to throw back to this morning when we said sharp-end work happens all over your organisation. Probably the most, one of the larger reflections I had when I came back to Sydney and Drew was after sitting through a 4-hour quarterly management safety meeting and going, we spoke about safety for 4 hours and we never had one discussion about a specific risk that was facing our workforce. It's like, what does our board want? What do we think's happening with culture? Patting each other on the back for doing a good job as managers and that. And I went, what is all this stuff that's going on and being done? So I think that idea of, that's a sharp-end activity. Don't mistake that management meeting and decision-making is a sharp-end activity. So then reframing how I said, okay, the next time we're having this meeting, we're going to frame every conversation on the basis that there's 30 of our frontline workers sitting around in here and listening to how we have the management conversation about safety. And then give us feedback at the end about how we've helped them in that 4-hour conversation. So I think that idea of exploring everyday work and thinking about like what's happening and how close it is to what you've intended, you can reshape work all throughout your organisation. I don't know if that...
This is not my question. I think I didn't...
Okay.
I'm talking about the safety department, and we have a safety manager has to delegate some of the safety 2 activities to his subordinates from the safety department.
Yeah.
But these safety people are not really in a good position in terms of access to knowledge and in-depth understanding of safety 2 to be able to go and do the job of observation.
Why do they need to know that? They need to know how to ask questions and talk to people.
Yeah, because they need to understand the logics behind safety 2 and all these trust issues and how to be able to understand the assumptions that people have and work. So
I think all I'd say is, send them to us. We have a good I don't know. So the concepts and the ideas in safety 2, with all respect, Eric, are not that complicated to understand. They can be complicated to implement and to figure out how we do it. But I don't think understanding is the problem. I think our challenge. So I would be very surprised if there's a safety manager that's practicing at the moment that in an hour I couldn't help understand how they need to think about their role and safety within their organisation. But I don't know. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I don't think everyone needs to do a PhD.
Exactly. So I'd just like to make a comment on that, if I could. So Dave did a podcast recently around this. It was a podcast or a forum that you had around this. So I actually got my safety team together to listen to Dave talk about this. And it was an hour or something.
Yeah, there's actually MyOsh webinar. It's free online.
That's it, webinar. That's what it was.
A slightly longer version of this presentation.
Yeah, and it was awesome because we sat down and we listened to it as a team. The whole team listened to it, and then we had another hour after that talking about what does that actually mean for us as practitioners, and what did we need to do to change our mindset around how we were going to operate in the field, and what skills and what gaps do they feel that they had, so that my role then is to help to facilitate their understanding. And then I think that for me was it's part of the discussion and the building capability of our function as a cohort. I think there's a gap. I think there's a gap in terms of people's understanding, and also what I found with my team is that they went through a journey of change. I call it the J curve. So grief came into it because the value proposition that they thought that they added to the business actually isn't really what they thought it was. So there's a journey that they are going through at the moment around that. So what I would say is an hour to listen to the webinar and an hour to have a talk to your team is a really awesome place to start.
And it was free.
It is free.
Right.
How close are we doing? Sorry, go Pete. No, go Pete.
No, one more, that's it.
I think another area is also the group that is coming through now through universities. So I know another university that's not the one that was previously mentioned.
Wollongong, mate, or where? Wollongong?
Yeah, could be. Yes, very much so. But they are actually, the engagement with Leanne, who's down there, she's been along to a couple of these conversations before. It's about understanding how we can influence what they do as well at university programs. So the conversation she's starting to have with the students there is, right, how do I get these people ready for work? It's not about, when I went through it was all about risk assessment systems and stuff, and I walked out and I went, geez, I can save the world by doing a risk assessment. And you go, it's rubbish. But it's that conversation is starting at universities as well, and I think that's where the better practitioners coming out, spitting them out with the knowledge to how do I ask the right questions to get the right information about work to support the right outcomes is really key in there as well.
Yeah, great. And you'll always be able to move faster in your organisation than kind of like that back-end system. But that's why we try to, Griffith and Drew and I, we try to author chapters in the body of knowledge to help Pam and the AIHS out in relation to that, because then that feeds into the INSPO capability framework that then informs accreditation of university programs. So we are trying to actually make systemic change into what it means to be a safety practitioner and what the knowledge and capabilities that need to underpin that are. But you can move really fast.
No, I can't say anything more. I'm pushing everyone away from there. I mean, as well, David said,
Come on, Andy.
Come on.
Okay. Well, I teach in Wellington at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand, and we're already, using a lot of Dave's research because the students want to know what modern safety research is coming up with. So they're demanding this, and we're building that into our masters and postgraduate programs as well. So we're entirely grateful for Sid's work, for Dave's work, well, for everybody who's been involved in producing this recent research. And AIHS, that body of knowledge is phenomenal for us. I know there's criticism from some people saying it's not everything. Well, yeah, it's not everything. We have to start by getting our students curious and asking better questions. So, yeah.
Cool. Let's give Dave a big round of applause.